This is a reading of an article by Scott Consigny called Rhetoric and Its Situations, which is an article from the journal Philosophy and Rhetoric, Volume 7, Number 3 from 1974. In the rhetorical situation, Lloyd Bitzer argues that the objective rhetorical situation dominates the rhetorical act. Indeed, so controlling is situation, he argues, that we should consider it the very ground of rhetorical activity. Bitzer claims, first, that the rhetorical situation is empirically determinate, consisting of an objectively recognizable exigence, or urgent problem, potentially modifiable through persuasive discourse, and a complex consisting of audience and constraints. The exigence and the complex, which generate rhetorical discourse, he claims, are located in reality, are objective and publicly observable historical facts in the world we experience, are therefore available for scrutiny by an observer or critic who attends to them. Second, Bitzer argues that the rhetorical situation is a determining situation in that it controls the response of the rhetor who enters it. Thus, the rhetorical situation does not invite just any response, but invites a fitting response. For if it makes sense to say that situation invites a fitting response, then situation must somehow prescribe the response which fits. For Bitzer, the rhetor's response is predetermined by the positive facts in the objective situation. And the rhetor who does not act appropriately has, metaphorically, failed to read the prescription accurately. In The Myth of the Rhetorical Situation, Richard Vatz counters Bitzer's thesis by emphasizing the creative role of the rhetor. For Vatz, the rhetorical situation is non-determinate in itself, for no situation can have a nature independent of the perception of its interpreter or independent of the rhetoric with which he chooses to characterize it. In itself, the situation is ambiguous and indeterminate, what William James may have called a buzzing, blooming confusion. Second, Vatz claims that the rhetorical situation, rather than determining the proper response of the rhetor, is itself determined by the rhetor. The rhetor is a completely free agent who creates the very reality of the rhetorical situation, for the very choice of what facts or events are relevant is a matter of pure arbitration. The rhetor translates the chosen information into meaning, meaning being a consequence of rhetorical creation. The rhetor is a true daemon whose symbols create the reality in which people react. Rather than encountering a well-posed problem which demands a proper solution, the rhetor creates and formulates the problem itself at will. The exigence does not invite utterance, but rhetorical utterance strongly invites exigence. Bitzer and Vatz, together, pose an antinomy for a coherent theory of rhetoric. For Bitzer, the situation controls the response of the rhetor. For Vatz, the rhetor is free to create a situation at will. I shall argue that this apparent antinomy arises from partial views which fail to account for actual rhetorical practice, and that this antinomy disappears with a complete view of the rhetorical act. In Part 1, I argue that Bitzer correctly construes the rhetorical situation as characterized by particularities, but misconstrues the situation as being thereby determinate and determining. I show that Vatz correctly treats the rhetor as creative, but that he fails to account for the real constraints on the rhetor's activity. The rhetor cannot create exigencies arbitrarily, but must take into account the particularities of each situation in which he actively becomes engaged. To resolve the apparent antinomy of rhetor and situation, I propose a mediating third factor, namely, rhetoric as an art. In Part 2, I established two conditions such an art must meet to allow the rhetor to become effectively engaged in particular situations, the conditions of integrity and receptivity. In Part 3, I argue that this art of rhetoric is an art of topics or commonplaces, showing how a command of topics provides the rhetor with a means for exploring and managing indeterminate contexts.